Well, we started out this morning what we're going to be finishing up here this evening, and I'm so glad that you're here this evening. If you weren't here this morning, I would really encourage you to grab a CD of this morning's lesson or download it on the website and try to take a listen to it, because tonight's going to make a little bit more sense. It's going to be a little more balanced with what you hear this morning. And I would encourage you, if you had friends or neighbors and family members, and I know some of you did this morning, they're here this morning, but they're not here tonight, to encourage them to listen to this lesson either on the website or grab a CD and have them listen to it there, so that we can have the whole counsel of God on this issue. In this morning's lesson, here's what we did. We established what the New Testament teaches about music in worship. And here were our 4 main points this morning, and that is, we were answering the question, why do we exclude the use of instruments in our worship? That's a common question. People come in here and they want to know, where's the band? Why are there no musical instruments? Why don't you play anything? I've heard people say, why don't you have music? And I say, we do have music. We just all sing it, right? Well, here's why. God has all authority, and we follow His will. God is our creator. We are the created. It is not up to us to just do as we please, to just kind of wing it and do whatever we want with regards to how we serve Him and how we worship Him. God is spirit, and we must worship Him in spirit and in truth. And so we try to do that here. It matters to God how men worship Him. And so we think worship is important. The Bible teaches worship is important. It matters to God how men worship Him. It mattered before the law of Moses. It mattered during the time of the law of Moses. It mattered in the New Testament church and still matters today. And when we look at New Testament worship, it was always vocal. It was always singing. And we looked at every instance where Jesus or His apostles or the disciples were worshiping together in offering up some type of praise to God, and it was always singing. It was always vocal. And history confirms that. We looked at a lot of historical references, and if you want the notes to this morning's lesson, I'm glad to share them with you. I can email them out to you, print them for you, so you can have the notes from various authorities, from various even denominational leaders and founders who all admit that up until at least the 6th century, music was all a cappella. In fact, the word a cappella, someone brought that to my attention this morning after the lesson, means as in chapel. Where did that phrase come from? A cappella, as in chapel. That's how people used to sing in the 1st century church. They sang without instruments. And that's really, the origin of that word tells us a lot in and of itself. So, being a New Testament church ourselves, we want to imitate the simple practices of the 1st century church. But some object to this position. They object to the idea that we need to only sing, and that there be no instruments. And they are going to strive to justify their own practices. And that's what we do when we feel as though maybe the message is pointed towards us. We try to justify ourselves. We try to come up with a reason or excuse. And we're going to look at a lot of those reasons that I've heard over the years in talking to people, and probably that you've heard as well, reasons that some of you have already brought up to me between this morning and this evening's lesson. And I want to answer the common objections and the quibbles of those who would seek to justify instrumental music. So, stay with me here. The first objection would be this: well, that's just your tradition. And we're going to go through this one very quickly. But as established in our previous lesson, this is not just a Church of Christ tradition. That's what some might say, but that's just not true. In fact, the Catholics, the Greek Orthodox, the Presbyterians, the Wesleyans, the Methodists, the Baptists, all opposed the instrument in their early days. And we quoted from all of those people and sources to prove that very fact. In fact, it used to be everybody's tradition in Christendom. It used to be everybody's tradition that we sang a cappella. So not just our tradition, that's not really the issue. More importantly than it being a matter of tradition, it's a matter of authority. It's a matter of thus saith the Lord. That's why we do it, not because it's a tradition, a man-made tradition handed down to us. It's a God-derived tradition. And God-derived traditions need to be respected. In Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 16, Colossians 3 and verse 16, It says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And whatever you do, in word or deed, whatever you do, that's everything. That's all encompassing. Whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus. That means by the authority of Jesus. Everything we do, we need to make sure that we've got the authority of Jesus for doing it, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. And that's really why we do this, because as we look at Jesus and His example, we look at His apostles and their example and what they taught, this is all we see from them. And if we're trying to practice plain, simple New Testament faith, that's what we'll imitate. Well, a second objection is this, and we touched on this morning, but we'll get a little bit further with it here this evening, and that is, well, it's in the Old Testament, right? The argument is, you're saying that instrumental music is wrong in worship, and yet it's in the Old Testament. Well, it is in the Bible. It is in the Bible, and it is in the Old Testament. You're right. So is the burning of incense. So are burnt offerings and sacrifices. So is circumcision. So is tithing. So are we trying to say that we should ignore the New Testament pattern in favor of Old Testament practices? I want to think with you about an illustration. I was at the bank. This was back in Indiana. I was at the bank one time, and I went up to the teller, and I went in there every Monday. I used to get a check every Sunday. You guys are automated now. I like it. I don't have to go to the bank anymore. But every Monday morning I talk to the same teller, right? And a teller would have a conversation, and one day she saw the name on the check. She saw that, it's from a church, and so we started talking about religion a little bit. And asked her how I was going. She said, my fiance and I were trying to decide on a church. She said, we went to New Covenant Church, but she said they always talk about tithing, and it's starting to upset my fiance because it seems like this is all that they're talking about. And I said to her, hold on a minute. You go to New Covenant Church, and they're trying to bind Old Covenant tithing on you. Doesn't that seem a little bit ironic? In the New Testament never commands tithing of New Testament Christians. There's never an example of tithing among New Testament Christians. And so we don't bind that here. There is giving, and we could talk about that, but that's not the purpose of this lesson. We need to not go back to the Old Covenant. That's the point. In Psalm 66 and verse 13, this is what the psalmist once wrote. He said, I will go into your house with burnt offerings. I will pay you my vows, which my lips have uttered. My mouth has spoken when I was in trouble. I will offer you burnt sacrifices of fat animals with the sweet aroma of rams. I will offer bulls with goats. Friends, because the psalmist wrote these things in the Old Testament, should we pick them back up and begin practicing them? And most people are going to say, no, of course not. But what makes instrumental music any different? It's just as much in the Old Testament, the old law, that we are no longer under today as burnt offerings and sacrifices. And the big difference is not that God's word is unclear here. It's when it comes to this issue, it's our prejudices and our personal desires that cause us to cloud out the truth. Let me illustrate again the inconsistency of many churches that argue instrumental music is in the Old Testament. Let's just suppose, for example, if somebody decided to go and place membership at a local Christian church here in Columbus. Most Christian churches use instrumental music in their worship. So let's suppose that this new member says to one of the elders, hey there, I was hoping that I could offer a burnt sacrifice at your worship service today. What would the elder say at that Christian church? Well, of course, they'd say, well, I'm sorry, we can't allow you to do that. He says, well, why not? It's in the Old Testament. What would they say? They would say, well, we're not under the Old Testament law today, and so, we don't practice that. Another guy comes in to one of those churches and says to one of those Christian church preachers, he says, hey, I really feel like we should all get circumcised together. What would those men say? Sorry, bud, you're on your own there, right? And he might reply, well, why is that so? The Old Covenant, the Old Testament law says, teaches circumcision, so why not? He says, we're not under Old Testament law today. Another guy comes in and says, I'd like to burn some incense today before the congregation. What would be the reply to him? Sorry, we don't do that here, right? And then he might say, well, why not? It's in the Old Testament, their reply would be, we're not under Old Testament law today. And then somebody walks in and says, you know, I play a great piano. Do you mind if I start playing for you here at church? Now, if he walks into a Christian church, my bet is that they're going to work hard to try to find a place for him there to use them in their service. But consider the big inconsistency that they've just stepped into by allowing it. They just told 3 other guys you can't do something because it's a relic of the old law, and yet this 4th guy walks in, wants to play a piano, and they let him go ahead and do it. And then what's the reasoning of many of the preachers and the elders of the Christian church? Well, it's in the Old Testament. That's inconsistent. That's just not fair. You rejected 3 other guys who used that argument, but when it suits you, you decide to use it for yourself. The New Testament church needs to be able to prove their practices from the New Testament, or else they are only partially a part of the church that Jesus built. Objection number 3. We used to be on the radio when I was in Kokomo. I had an hour program every Sunday morning from 8:30 to 9:30. Actually, it was from 8 to 9. So I'd go do the program in the morning and then go preach that same morning. It was a call-in program the first year that I was on there. So people would call in and we would have topics and we would talk about things. And the first time that I heard this argument here was during that call-in program. We had a program on instrumental music, which was one of the most popular programs we had during my time there. And one day when that topic came up, a caller called and he said, you know, instruments are going to be in heaven, so why would they be wrong in the church? And that caught me off guard. I never heard that before. So I started thinking about that, and he actually used a verse. He said, you know, Jesus said, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so I got to thinking about that. It took me a minute to wrap my head around it. I hadn't ever heard it before. And so I want to think about it with you. And I want to give you some reasons why that's an invalid argument. First of all, you do find instruments used symbolically in the book of Revelation, seemingly in heaven. But I want you to consider for a minute something about the book of Revelation. First of all, consider this. Consider that the book of Revelation is symbolic. There's a lot of symbolic language that is used. In Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1, this could turn into an entire Revelation sermon, and this is not the purpose of this, but I just want you to look at a couple of verses. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1. I'm not putting any verses up there today. Sometimes we spoon feed you. Sometimes you got to pull out your own fork and eat. So you can pull out your own Bibles, take a look. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. He sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John. Key word there is signified. Signified. Within the word signified, you have the word sign. A sign is often used as a symbol. We have stop signs, a red octagon, right? What does it mean? What's the symbol mean? It means stop. Signify something. John is telling us from the very first verse of his book that he is writing some things that are symbolic. They're symbolic language. In Revelation chapter 5 and in verse 8, take a look at a sample there. It says, when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures, the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. I think we all know the Lamb is symbolic. It's not a literal lamb. The lamb represents someone. I would have to say Jesus Christ here. Each of them had a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are prayers of the saints. Now, we understand that the lamb is symbolic. The 24 elders may very well be symbolic. The 4 living creatures very well may be symbolic of something. But the harp, that's literal, right? First of all, we have a little bit of a problem because we might be being inconsistent with the language there. All right? The book of Revelation is written in symbolic language. Now, the first verse indicates that, and a symbol doesn't symbolize itself usually. You have to keep that in mind as we study Revelation. If what we see taking place in Revelation is literal, and if we're supposed to be doing, I want you to think with me about this line of logic. If we're supposed to be doing what's happening in Revelation here on earth, in those visions in Revelation, then think about what we should be doing. Well, in the book of Revelation, you have the physical temple. Revelation 11, verse 1. Revelation 3, verse 12. Revelation 7, 15. Revelation 15. You have a physical temple that's mentioned in Revelation. You have a physical altar of burnt offerings, which is mentioned in chapter 6 and verse 9, mentioned in chapter 8 and verse 5. You have a physical altar of incense in the book of Revelation, chapter 8 and verse 3, chapter 9 and verse 13. You have golden bowls full of incense in chapter 5 and verse 8, chapter 8 verse 3. You have an olive tree, and you have a lampstand in chapter 11 and in verse 4. You have signal trumpets. You hear about the blowing of the trumpets from time to time in Revelation. You have those in chapter 8 too, in verse 6, in chapter 9 and verse 14. You have the Ark of the Covenant in the book of Revelation in chapter 11 and verse 19. And you have physical Jerusalem for God's throne and God's presence in chapter 21 and verse 2. And you have those instruments. If we're going to do everything on earth the way it was done in heaven, we've got a lot of other things we should be doing. Right? Here's the problem is we're taking the visions of Revelation and what we see there, we're taking it literally. We can't rebuild a temple. We can't rebuild its services. And that's not the intent of the book of Revelation, is to encourage that. Heaven is a spiritual place. Why should we think there's going to be physical harps or physical instruments there? It's a spiritual place. We read in Matthew 22 that we're not even married or given in marriage in heaven. Things are going to be different in heaven than they are here on earth. And so to say worship in heaven is going to mirror our worship on earth is a false assumption. For example, there's going to be no Lord's Supper in heaven. 1 Corinthians 11 verse 26 says that we eat, we partake until He come. It's going to come to an end when Jesus returns. We're no longer going to participate in that. So it's not equivalent to say what's done in heaven is done on earth, or what's done on earth is going to be done in heaven. That's not a fair argument. It's really taking the prayer of Jesus out of its context. We're not going to preach the gospel to the lost in heaven. We're not going to need to contribute financially in heaven. There are many songs that we're going to sing here on earth that we're not going to need to sing anymore when we get to heaven and our hopes are fulfilled. And so saying that worship in heaven is going to be the same as worship on earth is not the idea of thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That passage has been twisted to make a proof text argument that betrays the real meaning of the text. The real meaning is just simply this. If God demands something in heaven, it's done. And if God demands something here on earth, His will needs to be done. It needs to be done here, it needs to be done there, though His will may be different here and there. Objection number 4 is this. People will say this when it comes to instruments. Jesus never prohibited worship with instruments. And so we want to think about that for just a minute. We did touch on this morning as well. But I want you to notice what it means when Jesus or His apostles specify a thing. We need to understand specific authority. If Jesus specifies a thing, it often prohibits all other exceptions. It's been said by some that there's no law against instrumental music, right? And where there is no law, there is no sin, for sin is the transgression of the law. The word transgression, that word is one that you find in 1 John 3 and verse 4. Here's what transgression means. Transgression means to go beyond certain prescribed limits. That's what transgression is. You go beyond prescribed limits. John said in 2 John 9, whoever goes onward and abides not in the doctrine of Christ has not God. You went beyond the limits that Christ set in His doctrine. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 6, he says, you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written. We need to be careful not to think beyond what is written. There is a law on how to praise God. The law says, sing. There are verses, there are commands, there are examples. They say, sing. And so to go beyond the law is transgression. It's to go beyond the prescribed and the authorized limits. Instrumental music in worship is going beyond the law of worship. Instrumental music is transgressing the law. Now I want you to see how we get ourselves into a big hairy mess when we start making this argument that Jesus never said not to. And I want to use another issue that's pretty common today. And I want you to see how they're making really the same argument that some are making on this issue. One of the biggest arguments in the homosexual movement today, as they try to justify homosexual marriage, is they say, well, Jesus never condemned it. Jesus never said not to. Now think about that. Did Jesus ever say, no, you can't be married, two men can't be married to each other, two women can't be married to each other? Did he ever say specifically those words? He didn't. He didn't. They're right. Jesus didn't say not to. He never prohibited polygamy per se, not in those words. But here's what Jesus did. Jesus specified that a monogamous marriage is between one man and one woman. Jesus specified that a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and those two shall become one flesh. He specified what God-directed marriage is. It's a man and a woman who are joined together for one lifetime. He didn't have to say, not two men. He didn't have to say, not four women. And the list could go on and on ad nauseum. When God said he wanted Israel to sacrifice a lamb, God didn't need to say not a giraffe, not a crocodile, not an elephant, not an armadillo, and not a dolphin, and not a unicorn. He specified what he wanted. And when God specifies a thing, that prohibits all else. Jesus or his apostles never said, don't smoke crack cocaine. Did they? But he did specify the importance of self-control. The apostles rebuked the enslavement to addiction. So the issue was addressed without there having to be a thou shalt not. There doesn't always have to be a thou shalt not for everything we're not supposed to do. And we understand that in real life. We understand we don't need to have a list of exclusions if we've specified what we want. But sometimes we want to play some word games with scriptures to make them say what we want. The fifth objection would be this. There's a bunch of them. If it's okay at home, why not in worship? We've heard this sometimes, right? If it's okay for me to do it at home, why would it be wrong for me to do it in worship? And it's important to note a key distinction. The home is circumscribed by moral law. Church is circumscribed by scriptural law. And because of this, some things that might be morally right in the home may have no business in the church. I want you to consider a couple of examples. I would encourage you, if I ever come to your home, before you cook food for me, that'd be wonderful, I would encourage you to wash your hands. Okay? Do it, please. I would appreciate it. But Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for ceremonially washing their hands as a part of their religious service to God in Mark 7. Is there anything wrong with washing your hands? No, but there is something wrong when it becomes man's tradition that we've required upon all others as a part of true religious service to God. It's morally right, but religiously as a law, it's wrong. There's nothing wrong with eating dinner. But the Apostle Paul rebuked the church at Corinth for turning the Lord's Supper into a common meal and for neglecting its primary spiritual purpose in 1 Corinthians 11. What might be morally right was, in that particular case, religiously wrong. It's morally right to eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I would prefer peanut butter banana with a little bit of honey. But it's morally right to do it. You can do it. But when I decided to substitute PB&J for the unleavened bread and fruit of the vine that Jesus commanded as we remember his death, and he specifically told and showed us the example of what we were to do, then I transgress his law. Just because something is morally right doesn't mean it has a place in the church's worship to God. So the argument that instrumental music is permissible in the home should be in the church, not a valid argument. There are some things morally right in the home the church is not commanded to do in their corporate worship. Sixth objection might be this. Well, we're using the instruments as an aid, not as an addition. And I've heard that a lot. That's probably one of the instrumentalists' favorite arguments. Well, we need an aid to our worship, and so we use the instruments as an aid. I think that's a sophistical dodge and an excuse. And I want to show you why I think that's a dodge and why that's not true. I'm going to give you an example from real life. I went and visited a church's youth service one Sunday night when I lived back in Indiana. And we had our services at 5. There was a time we had our evening service at 5 in the winter and 6 in the summer. That was confusing, so we quit doing that. But 5 o'clock, and then they had a youth service at a local community church at 7, and somebody was trying to teach a friend there, and they said, Josh, I would like you to come, just kind of see so that we can talk about it. I said, sure, yeah. As long as it doesn't conflict with our church service, I'll go somewhere else and see, and we'll talk about it. When I went there, a guy ran out on the stage. They had the countdown timer, and as soon as it hits 1, boom, the drum beat smacks, and the rock and roll starts playing. The spotlight came down, the dry ice was rolling, and the fog was everywhere. And they began playing a tune. They played the tune 2-3 minutes. There was never any words to any song. Nobody sang. There were young people swaying, hands in the air, very much a club atmosphere. I've never been to a club, so I'm assuming it's a club atmosphere. But there is something interesting. There's no words, there's no singing. It was all instrumental music. And then those people came up to me later and said, well, it's just an aid. How are you aiding singing when you weren't singing at all? You're not aiding singing. And I would venture to say that there's a lot of church groups who play instrumental solos and pieces that don't have any vocalists. Many times, you're not aiding singing when there is no singing. Singing in that case, it's certainly and clearly an addition, not an aid. Now, people who say that, they'll say, well, if the instrument is an addition, then so is a psalm book. So where do you have the authority to have a psalm book? Or, Kevin was blowing a pitch pipe before he started the tune to a song, so where's the authority to that? And so I'll ask you this question. If you're going to sing, do you need notes to sing? You do, or else it's not going to be very good. Do you need words to sing? Well, yeah, if we're going to sing words so that people can understand and the mind can be affected, we need words. You can't teach, you can't sing like we're commanded to do without words, without notes. Now, we could sing memorized songs. We could find them in a hymnal. We can project them on a screen for the congregation to see. But no matter what we do, we're using these notes and words to do exactly what God has commanded. God has commanded us to sing. But when I use an instrument, and when a church sets up orchestras and bands to play music for the church, they're not merely aiding the singing anymore. They're performing. They've introduced a completely separate act. They're playing. We need notes. We need words. And by supplying those, we're still performing the act God commands. This kind of illustrates it a little bit here. We're commanded to eat the Lord's Supper. What do you have to do if you're going to eat the Lord's Supper? Well, you got to serve the supper in some type of a cup. The juice has to go in something. We need trays, maybe to serve the bread or some type of something. Maybe you need attendants. That's not really mentioned in Scripture, but it's something you need so that people can be served. But in addition to that would be if we use, instead of fruit of the vine, use Coke. Or if we decided instead of the unleavened bread to use a hamburger. We're doing something different. When God has specified unleavened bread and fruit of the vine and we use something other than, we have created an addition. We've changed the command. Same thing when we're commanded to sing. We need a pitch pipe could be helpful, or a tuning fork. You need a song leader, maybe to get the song started so we know what song we're all supposed to be singing. That keeps things organized. You might need a psalm book or a projection system, but when you add an organ, you're doing something besides singing. You're playing. You've changed the word. You've changed the act. When you add a piano or drums. I like to use Noah as an illustration. Noah's told to build an ark, right? It never says anything about hammers or nails or workers. But in order to build a boat, probably going to need some hammers or some nails, right? So that you can accomplish the task God has given you. Now, Noah's told to build an ark out of gopher wood. If Noah had said, well, I prefer oak, or I like cherry a little bit better than gopher wood, I'd prefer to use that, then he would be doing something in addition to and different from what God commanded. It's no longer an aid, it's become an addition. He's substituted what he wants for what God has called him to do. Objection number 7 is this one. My mother grew up in the Baptist church before she converted to Christ. And this argument was one of the main arguments that she was taught. in the Baptist church as a justification for instrumental music. And the idea is something like this. Well, if someone has the talent of playing an instrument, and we have some people here who have the talent of playing an instrument. So if you have the talent of playing an instrument, they should use that talent for God. We ought to use our talents, is what people say. Now, this justification is taken from a broad misunderstanding of the parable of talents. That's in Matthew chapter 25, right? You know about the 5-talent man, the 2-talent man, the 1-talent man. 5-talent man multiplied his talents, the 2-talent man multiplied his talents, the 1-talent man buried his, and he's called a lazy and a wicked servant because he didn't do anything with what he was blessed with. Let's consider, first of all, a couple of things. Talent. I think sometimes we've taken that parable and we've turned it into something a little bit different. Talent is not a word that was a reference to natural ability, but to money. And so let's understand what talent really meant, scripturally speaking. Talent was a form of money, not an ability. But let's say that we do kind of interpret that broadly and we apply those principles broadly. I would also tell you that it presumes way too much. Let me give you an example of how ridiculous this can get. My wife grew up in Peru, Indiana, and she used to be in the circus when she was growing up. Some of you didn't know that. She stood on a bareback horse as it traveled around in a 3-ring circus. She flew from the flying trapeze. I'm telling you the truth. It's pretty cool stuff. Whenever things get boring at somebody's house for dinner, I just always bring that up. And the conversation just gets going, you know? Should we have her do some circus acts for Jesus? She's got a talent. My daughter plays soccer. She plays basketball. She likes to shoot 3-pointers. Should we put a hoop in here and let her shoot some 3-pointers for Jesus? Use it as our worship. Sam, he once won his school's jump rope contest. He could do all kinds of crazy stuff with a jump rope that I can't do. Should we jump rope for Jesus? Because that's his talent, right? The abilities that you have should be used to God's glory. Here's the thing. In the way God has commanded. In the way God has commanded. We've got several good cooks here. Should we set up a stove right by the pulpit, let them do their thing during the worship service? They're just using their talent. The argument goes too far. We could say the same thing. We got good mechanics here and good seamstresses and some hairdressers. To argue that it must be okay because they're using the talent that they have, it opens the door to a flood of problems. And maybe that's why we're seeing churches with Starbucks and miniature shopping malls opening up. Because we've taken a faulty line of logic to its extreme. The argument for instrumental music that says it should be allowed because we're using our talent proves too much therefore it proves nothing. It's illogical. It's based on a change of definition within a twisted text and fails to realize the restrictions and boundaries that God has set up for worship. I got 3 more. The last one's quick. I didn't say the 2 before it were. Objection number 8 is this. Instruments were in the synagogue during the time of Christ. Have you heard that? I used to go and listen to a guy who had a seminary about 30 minutes north of us in Indiana. And I would go to some of his classes that he had on Thursday night. They were free. Anybody could come. And I learned some stuff there. It was interesting. But he was very much in favor of instrumental music and pushed it very hard. And one of his favorite cliches, he preached a sermon on why he thought instrumental music should be in the church. And some of these points are actually from him in response to him. But he said, you know, the restorers and the reformers, this was his quote, they were running so far away from Rome, they ran right past Jerusalem. He said that all the time. And what he meant was, you know, we were objecting to the Catholic Church so much and some of the things that they had adopted and begun to practice that we failed to see that instruments were in Jerusalem, in the temple and in the synagogue. That was his argument. And so the argument's intended to make us believe that some of the religious leaders mentioned this morning, they were so busy fighting against the Pope, right, they failed to notice there was support for instrumental music. They just didn't catch it. Now here's the problem. The fact that you find something in the temple, first of all, and the fact that you find Jesus or a disciple there doesn't mean they approved of it. One of the other arguments he made is, look, some of the disciples were in the synagogues from time to time. In the synagogues, there would have been instrumental music because these were Jews who were worshiping. So Jesus and his disciples must have been okay with it, right? If the example of the apostle going into the synagogue to preach to the Jews is proof that they participated in the Jewish worship, have you stopped to think what that would mean? Those Jews had rejected Jesus as the Christ. Were they approving of that too? They didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God because they were there. Does that mean they agreed with that? Do we have the apostles participating in the worship of infidel Jews? Those infidel Jews may have had instrumental music, but they surely were not Christians. They were not engaged in Christian worship. In the synagogue worship, these Jews would have burned incense. They would have observed the Sabbath. And so by this logic that because Jesus and disciples sometimes went to the synagogue, so that must mean they approved of some of the things going on there, then the Catholics and the Seventh-day Adventists have as good of an argument as the music users, right? Because if they burned incense, the disciples must have been okay with burning incense, so we should do it in our churches. If they met on the Sabbath and the disciples were there on the Sabbath day, then that must mean that they thought worship should take place on the Sabbath day. If the example proves one, it proves it all. And so because it proves too much, it proves nothing. The facts are, the apostles went into the synagogue to preach the gospel to the Jews, to show them the difference between Judaism and Christianity. I've been to a bunch of different churches, and I'm not there always to approve of everything that is done. Sometimes you're there because it creates an opportunity for you to teach people, have a conversation with people about things that maybe are not consistent with Christianity. To say that because they were there means they approved is not necessarily right. It's assuming too much. The Jews opposed the teaching of many of these Christians. The Jews cast them out of their synagogues. The Jews put them into prison. But somehow we're supposed to believe that it's an apostolic example for music in worship. You ought to be ashamed of attempts like that to justify the use of instrumental music. It's really a biased stretch of the imagination. Here's one of the more common arguments, though, as we close. And that is the word sing could also be translated play. Okay? Anybody heard that? The word sing could be translated play. We're going to think about this. We're going to think about this before we finish up here. The word sing that you find in Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, those passages, is from a Greek word solo. Solo. And the word solo, as defined by Strong's, it means to twitch or to twang. That is to play on a stringed instrument, to celebrate the divine worship with music and accompanying notes, to make melody, to sing. And I use this definition in particular because this is going to be the definition that maybe at some point somebody shows you. This is what the word solo means. It means to twitch or to twang, to play. It's interesting that while this might be a definition, that in almost every translation of the Bible, the term solo is translated sing or making melody. I would be interested if anybody here today, tonight, if you have a translation of the Bible in front of you right now, if anyone has a translation that says play rather than sing or make melody. Fact is, nobody does because that's not how it's translated. The King James Version, it was translated by 47 ancient scholars in 1611. They all translated the term sing. The American Standard Version was translated by 101 modern scholars in 1901. They all translated the word solo as sing. These guys were Greek experts. Sometimes, though, we like to make the argument as if we're Greek experts that, well, that word really should mean play. Even though there's 148 scholarly translators, two of the best translations of the English Bible that never translate it that way. Now, in making this argument, the instrumentalist doesn't use the Bible, right? They don't use the Bible. They're trying to use the Greek lexicons to prove their point. So what do the lexicons say the word solo means? Well, we already quoted this for you. Solo means to twitch, to twang, to pluck. Now, I want you to think about it. What does this word mean? Does it mean sing? Does it mean play? Does it mean both? Well, solo really, just literally, here's what it means. It means to pluck. Okay? Stay with me. If you're going to pluck, you have to have something to pluck in order to solo. And so the word, actually in history, the word solo had various uses. A hunter, for example, plucked the bowstring to shoot the arrow. He soloed the bowstring. The workman plucked the carpenter's line. You know, you've got this chalk line and you pull it from one end to the other, and what do to make your line? You pluck it. You pluck the carpenter's line to make the chalk mark. He soloed the carpenter's line. This word was even used, applied to the barber who would pluck the beard and hair. I'm so glad we have clippers. He would pluck the beard and hair. So the barber soloed the beard. And a musician would pluck the chords of a musical instrument. So it was used in the sense of soloing an instrument. Now, Paul and other New Testament writers, they command us to solo. What do they mean? Did they want us to twang the bowstring, to twitch the carpenter's line, to play the mechanical instrument? And here's the thing, Paul tells us exactly what he meant. We don't have to guess. The text says Christians are to be singing and soloing with your heart. With your heart. The verb solo, like any other verb, it has an object. The object of the verb needs to not be turned into the definition. And that's the big mistake that most instrumentalists make. They automatically assume that because one can solo an instrument, that that's what the term means. It means to play an instrument. And that's putting our assumptions, it's putting our wishes into the text. Paul tells us what he intends for us to solo, and that's the heart. He's making a spiritual use of the word. Now, to illustrate that just a little bit more. The Greek word baptizo means to dip, right? You can dip someone in tar. You can dip them in sand. You can dip them in grease. You can dip them in vegetable soup. Some of you are going to be dipped in gravy on Thursday. You can dip someone in any liquid element that you'd like, but the Bible names the element in which we are to be baptized. And that element is water. And on the same principle, you might solo anything that can be plucked, from the hair on your head to a fiddle or to a Jew's harp. But Paul said solo with your heart to the Lord, not your harp. With your heart. And just as baptized with water names the element, excludes everything else, solo with the heart names the instrument and excludes all else. When any particular instrument was intended with solo, it was always named in addition to the word. In Psalm 98 and verse 5, David once said, solo with the harp. He specified what you solo with there. In Ephesians 5:19, Paul says, solo with the heart. So don't be too gullible to take that argument. Consider a little bit about what others have written and said and stated on it before we swallow that whole. I got whole lessons on every one of these. We could talk a lot more about it if you've got a lot more questions. But let me just get down to the last thing, that for some people, this is really what it comes down to. They're not going to use any of those Greek arguments, and they're not going to maybe go to the Old Testament. They don't maybe know about some of that. They're not going to get very technical. What it comes down to with a lot of people is if it feels good and uplifting, it must be right. I like it. And isn't that what a lot of things come down to when we're in conflict with God? God maybe doesn't okay it. Maybe he's not all right with it. Maybe in some cases he even condemns it. But if it feels good, it must be right. Proverbs 14:12 says, there's a way which seems right to a man, but the end is the way of death. Let's make sure that we're not doing things just because we like it, because it feels good to us. We do it because we've got a thus saith the Lord. That's what God wants. That's what God has authorized. That's what God has okayed. This verse scares me. 2 John 9, it scares me. And this is why I teach on this, and this is why I preach on this, and this is why I think it's important for us to stand on issues like this. It's because it matters to God whether you follow and obey his doctrine. In 2 John 9, anyone who goes too far and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. The one who abides in the teaching, he has both the Father and the Son. This verse should really give us pause. Before we accept or before we adopt a practice that is out of line with Jesus Christ, let's make sure that it's within His will. And He's called us to do it, that it's right in His sight. And as Jesus said when He Himself went to the cross, not my will, but thine be done. Let that be our words, and let that be our motto when it comes to our religious faith and our religious practice. Tonight, we're so glad that you're here, and if there's something that's been taught here that's been helpful to you, maybe you need to confess some wrong belief or some wrongdoing, you've got the opportunity to do that tonight. If you're someone who's not a Christian yet, we encourage you to begin your journey with Jesus Christ. And then, really, as you become a Christian, sing out with all of your heart in praise, glorifying Him, being thankful to Him with all of your heart for the great grace and salvation that He offers to us because of His death on the cross for our sins. That's really why we're singing. Let's not forget about that. Let's not forget that singing not just needs to be done without mechanical instruments of music, but it needs to be done with the whole heart, all of our soul, because we are glorifying and worshiping a God who's an amazing and a great God, full of grace, full of mercy and compassion for us. He deserves our praise and our glory, and He deserves to be worshiped in a way that's pleasing to Him. If you're subject to invitation tonight, you can come forward while together we stand and while we sing.